In the same neighborhood that the Quebec City Mosque is situated in, there were marches of white supremacists and neo-Nazi sympathizers protecting the neighborhood. The question now is how each political party and how each politician is going to decide to engage with Canadian Muslim citizens. Don't just look at the label or the color of who you're voting for. Look at the people and ask them questions. The more that we as a community are able to communicate effectively what our interests are and what we care about, the more politicians are going to listen. It's not that we have the ability to engage, it's that we actually have the ability to make massive change in this country. We have the ability to drastically change not only our lives, but the lives of our children. We have the opportunity to do something that is never done before, as Muslim minorities in a Western country.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you?
Welcome to the ISNA Canada Podcast. It's great to have you.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Just by way of a quick introduction for those who don't know who you are, Stephen Brown is the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM. He is a well-known leader and community organizer with decades of experience in the private sector, in organized labor, and in human rights advocacy. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us.
Always a pleasure. Always happy to be here at ISNA.
I know you spent a lot of your time doing advocacy and labor work in Quebec specifically. You yourself are from Quebec. So I think it's apt to start there because I think also the most recent news coming out of Quebec is Bill 21 and the Supreme Court and the bill going to Supreme Court to be heard in terms of the appeal that NCCM submitted. So on that note, can you walk us through why that's such a big deal, what it means for a bill to be heard at the Supreme Court of Canada, and what we should kind of expect from that?
Yeah, bismillah. Great question. So yes, I am from Quebec. I live in Montreal, and Bill 21 is in the rest of Canada, it's perceived as somewhat of like an oddity. People don't really understand what's going on. You turn on the news, it's always explained by politicians as something that has to do with Quebec culture, and it's a weird thing that's going on over there. Really, what this comes out of is a long conversation about the place of minorities in Quebec, and more specifically religious minorities. And there was every last single government going back 15 years has proposed some kind of legislation to take away the rights of Muslims. There was the Charte des Valeurs Québécoises from the PQ government. There was Bill 62 that banned women who wore niqab from being able to access public services. We took them to court for that. And then you have now Bill 21. And Bill 21 is particularly nefarious, not only in its content, but also in the way that it was passed. It was passed sous bâillon. It was passed basically, using the Notwithstanding clause, rammed through, and with very little debate, and on the back of an electoral promise to do what the current government of Quebec called, which is de régler la situation, to end the situation or the discourse once and for all. I'll never forget watching the current Premier François Legault after they passed Bill 21, and he was asked by a prominent journalist, Sylvain Roy, why did you pass Bill 21? And translating, he said, in order to avoid extremes, sometimes you got to give a little to the majority, right? He wasn't talking about chocolate bars. He was talking about the rights of minorities. And then he was citing the fact that because there's a lot of people in Quebec that don't like seeing people wearing religious symbols even in the street. And so in the way that they passed Bill 21 using the Notwithstanding clause, they basically took away the most fundamental rights and freedoms of a subgroup of Canadians and took the position that as by virtue of the fact that they're the democratically elected government, they can do this and the courts have absolutely no say and nobody has any recourse except the electorate and except the electorate of Quebec. And what that had the effect of doing, a a lot of people in Canada thought that this is just something that touched a couple of, brown people that wear funny hats, and it wasn't really going to affect the rest of the country. That's not what happened. Soon after Bill 21 was passed, you saw Premier Ford promising that he was going to use the Notwithstanding clause to ram through a collective agreement on teachers. You saw the Saskatchewan government using the Notwithstanding clause. You saw the Albertan government promise to use a Notwithstanding clause. You're seeing Pierre Poilievre's government also, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative opposition also looking at using the Notwithstanding clause to make changes.
Can you tell us a little bit more, for those who don't know, what the Notwithstanding clause is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the Notwithstanding clause is section 33 of our charter. So when you go through our charter, that's where you have the basic rights. So section 2, you have the rights of freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. But then you go into other sections, also sections 7 through 15, for example. And then you have other fundamental freedoms like the right to not be subject to cruel and unusual punishment, habeas corpus, protection against search and seizure, unlawful search and seizure, and others. So basically what the Notwithstanding clause allows governments to do is to pass laws notwithstanding your rights. So I know you have the right to freedom of religion. I know you have the right to be protected against unlawful search and seizure. I know you have the right to not be subject to cruel and unusual punishment. But as a government, I'm going to pass this law anyways. Originally, it was designed or intended to be used as a measure of last resort, in order to preserve people's rights in case the courts made a ruling that actually took people's rights away. But what you're seeing happening now in Canada is it's now being used by political leaders across the board to take away the rights of minorities, of unpopular minorities, or score political points. And so the reason why this is so important is because if as a country, we wind up in a situation where it is legal to take away the rights of people because they happen to be unpopular because a politician wants to, then we no longer live in a country where we have rights. We have permissions. Mm-hmm. And that is really concerning. And especially as Muslims, being the least popular group of Canadians in the country, the idea that it would be legalized to simply take away our rights because it's politically expedient is a danger. That every last single person in this country, especially Muslims, should be keenly aware of. So what 8 people decide in the next year or so on this particular file will determine whether or not politicians can get up and say, you don't like Muslims in your neighborhood? We can deal with that. You don't like Muslims praying in the park, for example. What François Legault recently said, we'll take care of that. You don't like, women who wear hijab in school? We can take care of that. You don't like the fact that people can congregate at mosque on Fridays? We can take care of that. There are no rights, there are only permissions. And so it's not just us, but a lot of people in Canadian society and civil society are very concerned about this. The decision of which is going to, is really going to determine what kind of country we live in going forward.
I think that specifically is interesting because I feel like in Canada, we don't really kind of pay a lot of attention to stuff that's happening in Quebec because we consider it some sort of like part of like this like Quebec exceptionalism, right? You're kind of like, oh, it's happening, but it's happening over there. And Quebec's like a little weird. They speak a different language. So like, we're not going to pay too much attention to it. And I know this is like a very Ontario-centric take, but, I'll own up to it. I'll say, I know we have our own biases. So I think it's important when you say that this is going to the Supreme Court because it impacts the entire country. And the politics of Quebec are not confined to Quebec only. And so I guess for the rest of us who kind of don't understand that duality between Quebec and the rest of the country, can you give us a little bit more insight into how Quebec politics fits into kind of a bigger national narrative?
That's a really good question. The most important thing to understand about Quebec is that every last single person in Quebec is a minority. Everybody. In Canada, in English Canada, like how would you define the majority population? Who's the majority population?
White folks.
Okay, well, like what kind of white folks?
Like English speaking.
English speaking WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants form, the bulk of the population. Well, in Quebec, the bulk of the population are formed by ethnic French Canadian Francophone Catholics. So even though in that particular part of the country, they're the demographic majority, across the country, they're a minority. And that reality underpins almost everything in Quebec. The fact that they speak a different language quite literally means that there's a good portion of the population that doesn't understand what's happening in the rest of the country, not because they're not smart enough or anything, but quite literally, what does somebody in Saskatchewan understand of what a politician in Japan is saying or in Italy, right? So that's one important thing to understand. The next thing that's important to understand in Quebec is that there is a history. The history of Quebecers is that of being politically dominated by the English. My dad worked at Bell Canada in the 70s, and he remembers saying, if you went downtown Montreal in the 1970s, you wouldn't know that it's a French city. The business class was all English. So English people owned the property, they owned the businesses, and French people were laborers. And another thing that's important to understand about Quebec is the cultural fragility of that reality. The United States of America, our neighbor next door, is the most influential cultural reality in the world right now. Somebody with a country with which we share much in common. So when people from India or Mexico or Turkey or Egypt come to Toronto, it is assumed that they will learn English. They will pick it up from watching TV, from just being around. Anglo-Saxon culture is pervasive in whether it's entertainment or whether it's academia. In Quebec, that's not the case. They're also the fastest aging demographic in North America. They have the lowest birth rates in North America. And so the question of identity politics is treated in Quebec as an existential question. When people in Quebec talk about issues of identity and culture and language and religion, the background signal is, are we going to exist in 2 generations from now? Will I be able to have a conversation with my grandchildren? Are we going to be just a remnant in history where people open up a book and say, once upon a time, people spoke French and went to Catholic church? And the Quebec government, especially from the 1970s going forward, took on the mantle of that, almost the advocacy agent for the Quebec people that is tasked with maintaining and protecting the Quebec nation. And so whereas before, what was identified as being the most, the greatest obstacle to the continuation of French Canadian culture in Canada were English Canadians, now it's viewed as immigrants, and especially Muslims, right? Because Muslims remind Quebecers of one of the darkest times in their history. A lot of people in the rest of the country don't know that in the 1940s, Quebec was the Catholic version of Saudi Arabia. Everybody that has gray hair remembers a time when a priest would knock on your door and ask, why haven't you had any kids in the past couple of years? So when they see Muslims, they see people that are religiously similar enough to them to remind them of their own tradition, but different enough from them to make them feel that there's something that's changing in their society. And so when Quebecers are approaching these questions, they approach it with a level of urgency and concern that the rest of the country doesn't understand, because it is a fear that English people don't live with. And that's why, when English people talk about, well, how is this going to affect the economy? How is this going to affect our international reputation? How the existential questions come before these questions. And so in Quebec, often in English Canada, for many immigrants, you belong insofar as you contribute. In Quebec, you contribute insofar as you belong. And that changes everything.
I think that answers a pertinent question that a lot of us have about Quebec and about the Quebec government, which is like consistently just trying to understand why do they hate us. And to your point, it seems like it's less about like the actual, existence of Muslims as Muslims and more so about their foreign quote unquote status to like the Quebecois society. And I think that is interesting segue into kind of looking more broadly at the entire nation and seeing how the discourse in Canada in general has shifted when it comes to Muslims, as it often does every, decade or two. It kind of comes back again to this like immigrant/Muslim question, especially as we near kind of an election, all of those things. But this time it kind of felt like we had gotten over that with, the whole like a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian discourse that was like there for a really long time. That slogan was really overused. But anyways, now we're kind of going back to this whole, what is the space that Muslims should exist in Canada? A question of whether or not Islamophobia is like an accurate term, all of those things. Can you like talk to us a little bit about how you see it from your vantage point, given also like the last year and a half and all of that? How you see the discourse in Canada changing more broadly?
Yeah. It has gotten a lot more difficult to be a Muslim in the last year in Canada. Islamophobia as a business model for many media outlets is back in full swing. Islamophobia as an election strategy for many politicians is back in full swing. And this time it's not just people that you see on TV, it's the people you go to work. When post October 7th, we started getting at NCCM tons of calls of people being harassed at work, especially medical professionals, legal professionals, academics, students. Simply being a Muslim, once again, carried the weight of being seen as threatening. Once again, for something that, is out of our control, that is quite literally happening on the other side of the world, across an ocean and 2 continents and the sea. And on the one hand, we've seen there's been a big uptick in Islamophobic discourse, mostly related to international politics. On the other side, what you're seeing is there's also much more of a pushback against that. Muslims born in Canada form the largest demographic of Muslims in the country. More Canadian Muslims are born here than born outside of the country. Many people who are here, people like yourself or even myself, I'm no spring chicken, but, our entire cultural identity is here. Back home is, Hamilton or Regina. And so the level of acceptability in our own community for being treated as second-class citizens is drastically reduced. The strength of institutions in our country, Muslim institutions, masajid, and community centers, has also really increased as well too. And the demographics of Muslims has changed the country. We live in a country where 1 out of 20 Canadians is a Muslim. And we went around and scraped the Muslim world of its professional class. And so you have now in Canada a statistically significant, well-educated, well-organized, determined population that is not interested in being treated like a second-class citizen. And so there's also much greater pushback against that. And so the discourse around what it means to be a Muslim in Canada is familiar in negative ways, but also new. It's not just about defining who we're not. It's not we're not terrorists or we're not foreigners. It's who we are and what we want and what kind of country we want to see. And that is both, it means that we're looking forward to a time where it's fraught with a little bit more risk, but also some really interesting possibilities.
I think that you paint a very interesting picture in terms of the shift that has happened from for example, the Harper era kind of discourse to now. I want to dig into that a little bit in terms of you talked about the Muslim community being able to push back. How do you see that kind of looking like in today's day and age? And how does the question of like assimilation versus like acceptance fit into all of that?
Well, okay. So pushing back, I'll give you an example. Once, I'll never forget getting a call sometime in December 2023, when somebody who was handling our IT was going, you guys are going to have to, reduce the amount of emails because we just can't keep up. In a matter of few months, Canadian Muslims had sent out over 90 million emails to our servers alone. You saw Canadian Muslims going out and protesting. And they're still protesting. This is reminiscent of what you saw, with Black Americans in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. Not the size, but the persistence of protests. I think what it really means is we're not just having conversations in coffee shops anymore. There are people in our community that are CEOs of large corporations, lawyers, partners in their law firm, surgeons, staffers, elected officials. These are people that have families. These are people that their loved ones are going through the consequences of acceptable hatred. I mean, as a Black person, and a Muslim, I see so many different realities in society. But, one thing I can say is, while as a Black person, I do still face racism in this country, it's generally speaking seen as unacceptable. Racism against Muslims is much more acceptable. It's socially acceptable. And there's a feeling that this is a profoundly unjust and undeserved. And so people are organizing to make sure that now our message is going to be heard. Young people aren't just going into engineering anymore. They want to be lawyers. They want to be artists. They want to be journalists. They want to be writers. They want to be able to shape the culture that we're creating as a nation. And that's where the question of assimilation versus, I guess, integration or multiculturalism comes in. I don't really know. A lot of these societal models I felt were built in an era before, were conceived in an era before there was, mass travel. I mean, it's the 21st century. It's called the internet and the airplane. The fact of the matter is multiculturalism and diversity is a reality. And it's going to be an increasingly present reality. And so I don't think it's so much a question of assimilation, at least in English Canada. I think what I see happening is cultural creation. You have people from all over the world that are sort of coming together and negotiating in real time. What does it mean to be part of this growing, economically vibrant, multicultural country? And Muslims, like other people in this country, are saying we're not second-class citizens. We have just as much of a right to participate in that conversation as everybody else. And we have something to offer. And that I find is really, really interesting.
Yeah. I think, to your point, the cultural production that we see now from Canadian Muslims is something that we didn't even see like just a decade ago. Like, to me, it's mind-blowing that of the top 5 like Canadian artists who are Muslim.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And they're talking about their experiences through their art. They're not shying away from the fact that they're Muslim, and they're talking about Palestine, and they're talking about Sudan, and they're talking about, even the things that they face as just individuals who exist in, Canadian society. And so I think that is profoundly different from kind of the discourse previously, and also the discourse in the US. I think we often kind of lump the two together in terms of like just North American Muslims. It's one and the same, and we pay attention a lot more to what's happening in American politics than we do to even in our own politics. And so I think in the same vein of like asking you the question about like Quebec exceptionalism, Canadian national narrative when it comes to Muslims, I think is different than the American one. Would you kind of be able to give us a little bit more insight into how Canada and its discourse and where you see that conversation going as we head into an election is fundamentally different than the conversation in the US heading into an election, or the same? Like, I don't want to kind of give you a biased question, but how do you see it from your point of view?
I always think back to sort of the slogan of each country that it uses to define itself. America is about, the pursuit of happiness, right? It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Canada is peace, order, and good governance. Right?
A lot more chill.
Yeah, a lot more chill, but a little bit more thought out as well too. How are you gonna have life and liberty if you don't have order? How can you have life if you don't have peace? How can you have happiness if you can't get along? Canadians also, I think we like to define ourselves. It's easier for human beings to define themselves as what they're not as opposed to what they are. And if there's one thing that most Canadians agree on is that we're not American. Whether it's we speak two languages or, we're more polite or, we're more progressive. Those are all sort of things that tend to structure the Canadian identity and how we differentiate ourselves from Americans. But another big part of what it means to be Canadian, or at least how we imagine ourselves, is that we're not as much of a warrior people. War isn't as much of a part of our culture as in the Americans. I don't know how true that is. I mean, like the Geneva Conventions was written in large part because of how many Canadian soldiers behaved in the First World War. But at least in the modern world, a lot of the wars of aggression and the wars in the Middle East, Canada hasn't participated in. I mean, we didn't participate in the war in Iraq. We're not interested in, the conversations that we're having about the Middle East. Those conversations don't imply us sending our college age kids over to the sands of Egypt or Palestine or Syria, to die. So when Americans talk about the Middle East, I have an aunt that lives in the United States and cousins that live in the United States. One of my cousins, she was in the army. When they're watching TV, many American families are thinking, are my kids going to wind up going over there and dying for some odd reason? The element of securitization and war is really present in the American discourse whenever they're talking about Muslims. And so much of the Islamophobia that we see in Canada doesn't actually start here. It's a contagion from other parts of the world. The debates around laïcité in Quebec don't start in Quebec, they start in France. And the issues of over securitization of Muslim communities don't start in Canada, they start in the United States. So I think the Americans have a much more violent discourse when it comes to interacting with Muslims. Canadians, it's much more passive aggressive.
Underhanded commentary,
but also, people won't come out in often cases and say you're the enemy and we need to watch out, but they'll treat us like that anyways, because they're watching CNN and they're watching Fox News. And if you repeat enough times that your neighbor is dangerous and can't be trusted and is out to get you, sometimes you might start to believe it. So it may not be official government policy that we're going to pick fights with Muslims, but our country winds up kind of following in the footsteps of the Americans anyways, despite our best efforts. And as a result of that, every last single Canadian politician, especially at the federal level, constantly has to ask themselves, what is the Canadian approach to dealing with the Muslim world overseas and its Muslim citizens domestically? And when we saw the end of the Harper era, and then bringing in the Trudeau Liberal government, for a lot of Muslims in the country, there was a sense that a lot of the worst times are behind us, and this discourse isn't going to come back. Well, surprise, it's back with a vengeance. And so the question now of how each political party and how each politician is going to decide to engage with Canadian Muslim citizens has yet to be decided. And the answer of that question is going to determine how 5% of the population across the country, and in many cases in urban communities, 10 to 15% of the population is going to engage with elected officials. And that is significant. Not just in terms of discourse, but also who's actually going to be sitting, passing laws in a couple of months from now.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of kind of, how do you see the Muslim community heading into a national election? How do you see the conversation around Muslims playing into the national election? I think a lot of Muslims are apprehensive right now. So kind of what would be your best advice to Muslims listening or watching?
What do you mean you see them as apprehensive?
I think a lot of people don't know what to expect. Like, Trump just got elected in the US. And so they're kind of watching this election and wondering kind of what comes next for Canada.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that is true. There's in our community, there's a lot of people that are asking questions about what the future holds. But one thing is for sure, there's an intense interest in the federal election. Almost everybody, whenever I talk to them, wherever I go in the country, it doesn't matter if it's Quebec, BC, Alberta, out east, everybody is interested in thinking about who are the politicians, what do they believe, what are their values, what policies are they interested in or planning on implementing. If there's one thing that I would say to the Muslim community is, whatever you do or whoever you decide to support, be informed and exercise your vote. I just, anecdotally, there's a lot of interest in this particular election. I expect there's going to be a really high turnout in the community. But the Muslim community should definitely talk to their politicians. At the end of the day, politicians in Canada, one of the good things about this country is we don't live for our politicians. Politicians work for us. So asking very specific questions about how are politicians going to treat us? Are they going to treat our institutions? Are they going to have particular scrutiny over our charities? Are they going to defend Muslim fundamental rights and freedoms? Are they going to engage in a foreign policy that endangers our family members? Are they going to have a discourse that favors a culture of respect and vivre ensemble, or are they going to veer into Islamophobic discourse? Are we going to work towards policies that help educate people about who we really are? Or are we going to sort of, just leave the area open for people that say negative things about us or tell lies about who we are? These questions are crucial for 2 million people. Don't just look at the label or the color of who you're voting for. Look at the people and ask them questions. And don't be afraid to ask them questions and tell them what you care about. The more that we as a community are able to communicate effectively what our interests are and what we care about, the more politicians are going to listen. And we have an amazing community. We have valid interests, and we have interests that are important for the country, and we have a lot to contribute. And so the more we get out there and the more we talk and the more relationships we build, the better it's going to be not only for us, but for all 40 million Canadians.
That's a very hopeful note to kind of end on, but I would be remiss to kind of end our conversation without talking about the Green Square campaign and the January 29th anniversary that's coming up. Why should Muslims still continue engaging with the Green Square campaign? Why should they kind of still continue beating the drums on the importance of combating Islamophobia in Canada?
Quebec is the canary in the coal mine in Canada when it comes to Islamophobia. The Green Square of the Green Square campaigns represents the color of the carpets in the Quebec City Mosque. And for anybody who's been to the Quebec City Mosque, especially if you were there soon after the massacre happened, the terror that people faced, the savage brutality, it really defined an entire community going forward. And the saddest part is, in Quebec, we saw the signs of this coming. In the same neighborhood that the Quebec City Mosque is situated in, there were marches of white supremacists and neo-Nazi sympathizers protecting the neighborhood. A little bit before the mosque, the shooting happened, somebody had left a severed pig's head in front of the mosque. And someone who was a journalist then and who is now an elected politician in Quebec basically said, "What's wrong with that? There's nothing illegal about putting a pig's head in front of the Quebec City Mosque." Quebec City was renowned for les radios poubelles, literally garbage radios translated, where it was the business model of shock jocks in Quebec City to just rag on Muslims all day long. Conspiracy theories about Islamists trying to invade Quebec society and radicalize schools and remove and change the secular nature of government basically became popular discourse. And people in the Muslim community said for a long time, if you guys don't do something about this, something bad is going to happen. It started with women who were starting to be attacked in the streets. It started with kids at school who started to be bullied. And then it escalated to threats. And then one day, a young man, after consuming all of this for, the better part of his life, picked up a gun and walked into the mosque and started shooting people. And had it not have been for the fact that one of his guns jammed, and had it not been for the fact that some of the men in the mosque rushed him, a lot more people would have died. The Quebec City Mosque massacre is a reminder of what happens when you allow hatred to go unchecked. And more importantly, when civil society and politics decides to try to leverage that hatred and that fear for their own interests. There's a cost to hatred. There's a cost to racism. There's a cost to Islamophobia. And that cost is the fact that blood was spilled of innocent people while they were, while they were shot in the back, when they were praying. And so every last single political leader and journalist and freedom-loving Canadian has to remind themselves every last single year that this pattern of behavior cannot continue in our country. And we have to do everything we can to eradicate it. And it's not just the responsibility of Muslims, it's everybody's responsibility. And so that's why we remember that's why we have the Green Square campaign every year, so that we as a country have the opportunity to remind ourselves that if we truly aspire to be this country of multiculturalism and openness and rights and laws and respect, you can't do that unless you also apply those same principles to Muslim Canadians. May God rest the souls of the martyrs of the Quebec City Mosque, and may God continue to watch over the Muslim community in Quebec City.
Amen.
Amen.
No, thank you for that reminder. And I think if there is one takeaway that I've heard you kind of repeat throughout this conversation, is that we all have kind of that responsibility to play, whether it's in, participating in the Green Square campaign and keeping the memory of the Quebec mosque shooting alive and kind of reminding everyone about the impact, the very real impact that Islamophobia has, or kind of continuing to be engaged in the civil discourse in this country, continuing to ask the right questions of our politicians, continuing to participate very actively as Canadians in political discourse. I think engagement is maybe the title of this conversation.
But I would add one more thing, and maybe
please.
It wasn't clear enough as well too. It's not just engagement. It's not, the message I want to pass is not just it's important to be engaged. The message I want to pass is massive change is possible. A lot of times we talk about this as it's some pie in the sky idea. I mean, I come from a family when my dad was born in 1949, Black people still didn't have the right to go to university. Engagement and working together yields results. And so it's not just that it's important for us to engage. It's not that we have the ability to engage. It's that we actually have the ability to make massive change in this country. We have the ability to drastically change not only our lives, but the lives of our children. We have the opportunity to do something that is never done before, as Muslim minorities in a Western country. And so, our responsibility is great, but also the possibilities are huge too. And that's why I'm so bullish on engagement, because it's not just Muslims that want to engage. Civil society and the rest of society wants to talk to us too. People understand that we have something to offer. People want to understand us. People want to be a part of that journey of us, of what we have to give, and us getting there together. So don't just engage with the knowledge that what you're doing is making a difference. If you would have asked our community 2 years ago, would Canada ever put sanction on Israeli settlers? Would Canada ever agree to arrest Netanyahu if he came to Canada? Would Canada ever impose a weapons embargo on Israel? Would Canada ever sign would they change their voting record at the United Nations? They would have said no. All of these things have happened. Canada became the first Western country to impose a weapons embargo on Israel. Canada became the first Western country to impose sanctions on settlers. Canada became one of the first Western countries to call for a ceasefire at the United Nations. When we sat around in November and made a list of all the things we wanted to accomplish, most people looked at it and said, "You're nuts," right? 4 months later, most of those things happen. And I go back to the number of over 90 million emails. It wasn't just emails, hundreds of meetings across the country, thousands of hours of content, reams of research that was done. Those things changed. Then you look, for example, let's go back to the conversation in Quebec. A decade ago, would a Canadian politician have looked the camera in the eye and said, Quebec, no, you're not allowed to oppress your minorities in peace. We're going to stand with the Muslim community. No, but the Trudeau government promised to intervene in the case in Bill 21. There's been reform on the CBSA. They were promised reform on the CRA. So,
what's the CBSA?
It's the organization basically that handles security at the border. CRA is the organization that handles taxation. So, Canada Revenue Agency. So, just in a short amount of time, policies that would have a large impact not only on our world here, but how we interact with the rest of the world and how our government interacts with us, have come to see the light of day. These are not this is not 5, 6, 7, 10 years in the making. This is a community getting together, putting their mind to something, and 7 or 8 months later, something comes out of it. It's unheard of. Those are that's just at the level of the federal government. You could go through a list of things that have happened provincially in the major provinces across the country. You could go through the list of, even mayors across the country calling for a ceasefire, changes to the way that police departments interact with Muslim communities. All of these things have come to pass. And so if that's what we can do by working together in a few months, what could we do if we had a couple of years? What could we do if we had a little bit more time to organize ourselves? What could we do if we worked with others and helped others achieve their goals and their dreams? These are just a few of the things that we've done. So that's why I say I'm optimistic, because regardless of the political party, not all politicians agree with everything that every Muslim says. But one thing I can tell you is all of them are interested in working with us. All of them are interested in hearing our ideas. All of them believe that we are going to be necessary for the future success of this country. And so don't sell yourself short. You matter if you're a Canadian Muslim. Yeah, let's just keep going. Let's keep being ourselves. Let's keep getting out there, and we'll keep making change.
Fantastic. On that note, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for all the work that you and NCCM do on behalf of the Muslim community. I know that here at ISNA, we're champions of that work. And I know so many Muslims who appreciate the amount of effort and support they get through NCCM. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And, I thank you to ISNA and thank you to all the viewers, because if it wasn't for the fact that we had amazing partners like ISNA and we had amazing and we were able to work with the community, just be, a couple dozen of us screaming in the desert alone. So
thank you.
Yeah.